Hey, everybody, and welcome to a very special Tuesday episode of Conversations, the show where we talk about the things that not enough people are talking about. And I'm very excited to have this conversation, which we had to reschedule, but there was no way it was leaving the calendar because it's too good. We're here to talk about inclusive language today. And I am super excited about this because, for one, I have been caught not using inclusive language. I'm sure many of us have. And quite honestly, one of the things that has been very powerful for me is being caught in that and then noticing, like, oh, hey, okay, this is a scenario where this is how I used to say things. And now it's so interesting for me because I'm trying to think of what I was watching the other day, and they were just like, ladies and gentlemen. And I was like, well, that's not very close. I'm sure it was from like the 50s or something. But I was just like, wow, there's so many places where this is happening. And so we're here to have this conversation today to empower us all to find a little more inclusivity in our language. And I'm super excited to have Jackie with me today to bring this conversation to the world because, quite honestly, the topic was prompted by one of their LinkedIn posts. So we have to give them credit for the topic. And so we're here to talk about it today. For those of you who have not seen the show before, this is a conversation, not just for the two of us, but for all of us. So we really encourage you to get in the conversation, share your thoughts, your experiences, your perspectives in the chat. We would love to include that and answer any questions you guys have on inclusive language as well today. So get in the conversation. Also, you can just say hello if you want to let us know that you're there. But this is also a very deep conversation. So there's probably going to be lots of thinking involved, lots of reminiscing on experiences that we have had. So sometimes that makes the chat kind of quiet. You guys use it. We would love to have you in the conversation. So before we get into the depths of this conversation, let's learn a little bit more about Jackie and why this conversation is so important to them. So Jackie, can you tell us who you are and what you're all about?
So my name is Jack, or Jackie Turnwald. I am a trans non-binary DEI consultant and former high school public educator of 19 years. And inclusive language has been important to me for a variety of reasons, both personal and professional. So, of course, as someone who uses they, them pronouns, that has been very challenging in recognizing how often people aren't thinking about using inclusive language. We frequently greet people using gendered terms, especially I live in the southern portion of the United States, and so there's also a lot of like ma'am and sirring that happens, that people are raised as this is polite behavior, but actually causes misgendering. And then also as a classroom teacher, you want to create an environment that is inclusive for all students, just as you would want to in a workplace or all the other places that we navigate. But I think teachers really spend a lot of time thinking about that, or should be, and making sure that we're using language that is inclusive, that is affirming, that invites all our students to the table, to really engage. And so, yeah, it's always been something that's been on the forefront of my mind.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that, well, let's just welcome, well, let's welcome our people before I get ahead of myself. Welcome, Robert. Welcome, Carl Sean. Thank you for joining us today, everybody. So, as somebody, and I think a lot of us grew up in this environment of the binary he, she, right? Like it's so interesting for me because I think it's programmed deeper than we even realize. And I have a son, and it's just, and I don't know, he's 4.
Right.
Even I say he, right? Like I just thought of this, but like, you know how in Harry Potter they get sorted into houses when they're 11?
Right.
Like maybe we should just use gender neutral terms until they decide that.
Right. A friend of mine, who recently had her first child, said, she about the baby while it was in utero, and she was like, "Or until she tells me otherwise," and kind of self-corrected because she was like, "Yeah, that's more of an open spectrum than we realize."
Mhm. It's interesting too. So I read a post. It wasn't your post, although your posts are great. But it was another post about how, like, why wouldn't we just consider using a gender neutral term until someone tells us otherwise,
Right.
right? Because I mean, for me, maybe this is getting kind of controversial, but I love controversial on this show. Right? Like, I am not offended if someone refers to me as they them, right? It doesn't feel wrong, and I can correct them, and that's fine. Or, like, quite honestly, I just that's fine. And so I was like, oh, this is a good point. Like, why wouldn't we? And so, Jackie, I don't know if you have any tips, maybe, but for those of us who are just very used to creating this binary divide, what are
Right.
some things that we can explore in our language, practice in our language, that can help us make it a little bit more gender
Absolutely.
neutral, inclusive?
I think it starts with even when we introduce ourselves. If we introduce ourselves with our name and our pronouns, it invites other people to do the same if they're comfortable doing so. Certainly is never a good idea to make it a requirement for someone to share pronouns in, some sort of greeting process. But to do it as an example and allow people the option lets people know that it's potentially a safe space for them to do that.
Mhm.
So that's a great thing to do. Um, I think when we think about inclusive language, a lot of it too is about considering history and the way that words evolve and change. Um, and while the denotation, the strict definition of a word may not change, connotation changes so much over time with historical context. And there comes a point where certain words, it is not appropriate to use them anymore because our understanding and context of how they are used has evolved in a way that we know better and we're doing better now. Um, Recently my partner decided that she really wanted to stop using the term crazy as a qualifier for anything. Um, and so using an accountability partner and saying, this is a word I'm trying to stop using. These are words that I'm willing to use as a substitute. If you hear me say this word, remind me, correct me. And so she'll substitute the word wild. That's wild. Instead of using a term that is derogatory as regards mental health.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, I think an accountability partner is actually a really good method to use.
Mhm.
Um, I think we also have to think about the feelings that we have when we get corrected on the use of inclusive language. It's really easy to get into that space of feeling a little defensive, like, I didn't mean to say a wrong thing. And sometimes people get overly apologetic, or they try to defend why they're using the term, when it's really so much better to be like, "Thank you," and make the correction and keep moving with the conversation. It can be a really fluid shift.
I think this is really interesting because I often experience this in a variety of arenas where people, they feel like they get it wrong, then they are bad. And we don't, most of us aren't out to be bad people, right? But then we get defensive about how that's not wrong. It's not bad, so that we don't feel bad. And one of the things that I'll just share this with you guys because I met this lovely individual and we're having a coffee chat, and I was like, oh my gosh, you have to meet this person, right? So I do a LinkedIn introduction, and
Right.
I always say, like, so and so, this is blah blah blah, and this is why I think you should be connected. Um, and I use she and the preferred pronouns they them. And so they messaged me back and was just like, hey, can you change my pronouns in this? And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I got that wrong. And yes, I went and I fixed it. And it's been really interesting ever since, because that scenario, although like when I was in a one-on-one conversation with them, I mean, it takes practice. It takes practice for us, right? Because we're used to just picking one,
Right.
like picking a he or she. And it was so impactful for me to actually get it wrong, because that's what now like gave me that extra oomph to remember that. So,
Right.
what and Jackie, you were an educator for a long time too. So how does this like idea of being wrong really impact how much we explore being more inclusive?
Absolutely. So, we talk about in the learning process that you actually know that learning is happening when people feel uncomfortable. And frequently in our society, as of late, there have been lots of complaints about how learning is making certain people uncomfortable. And it's like, that's actual growth. We don't want to remove that discomfort. In fact, we probably need more of it. However, we need people who are good at guiding through that discomfort to a place of understanding and not just leaving people in the place of discomfort. Um, but absolutely. So even, for example, the term preferred pronouns is an example of something that has had an evolution. We actually don't use preferred pronouns as the term anymore, and instead just say pronouns, because when we say that it's a preference, it's like saying that it's a choice. And so, for example, a trans man is a man. They're not, he, him is not their preferred pronouns. They are their pronouns. And so, for lots of us, myself included, I've moved away from using preferred as the term and just using pronouns. And that's an evolution that's had to happen. And I've had to be corrected on it at times, because for a period of time, that was what was used.
Yeah,
So,
and this is like, do you guys notice? Because I'm pretty sure I said that earlier. Boom. And this is I mean, this is why I like having conversations like this, right? Because I only know what I know from what I know. And until I have a conversation, I don't get to learn more.
right,
And this is my favorite thing, because now this is so cool, because I am trying to, I have some very old school parents, very traditional. Um, and I want to raise my son as inclusive as possible, right? And so it's my mom is very confused by the pronouns and the conjugation in the English languages and proper, and I'm like, but one of the things that's always been really interesting to me is that I identify as binary, right? So it's not about me trying to experience what it's like to be non-binary. It's about accepting that other people are that, and this is how I can be inclusive of them in my language. So, Jackie, where do you see sometimes these conversations getting intertwined as well, as about like, this is who I am, like
right.
and I am not that, versus this is who they are, and if they feel like this is a good representation of them, then that's all that matters as
Yeah.
far as.
I mean, it happens everywhere and becomes a relevant conversation more frequently than people might realize. So, probably the post that you saw that might have been inspiration for this was my trip to the pool. And I was participating in water aerobics. And the instructor kept saying, "All right, let's go, ladies." And every time they did, I was kind of like, it was just this little like sticking point. Um, and of course, I think most of the people in the pool were female identifying or assigned female at birth. But it wasn't closed to the participation of people of other genders. Um, And so it's like, okay, do I have a conversation about this? Do I just let it go? Do I and so in every situation that you're presented where the non-inclusive language gets used, you also have the question of, is this a situation where I'm going to do labor to teach someone? And sometimes people have the expectation of you doing the labor to teach them. Sometimes people are interested in receiving that labor, and sometimes you're not in a place to offer that labor because it's just kind of exhausting sometimes.
Yeah, and I can like I think this is a really big conversation as to like who's responsible for teaching the public
Right,
about this, right? Because still traditionally the public just gets pushed into these two categories, and there's probably even like lots of people who are just like, you know what, it's just like not even worth it, just like whatever, call me she, call me he, whatever. Like I don't want to fight this. um but I think that that's why it's so important, like the people who are joining us live here today and people like us who are interested in having these types of conversations, that we show up and we give people the space to learn and understand. And I want to come back to what Megan is saying here, because Megan was referring to the ma'am and sir.
yep,
And when these things are like societally polite, how, I mean, I have my own opinions on how we eventually get to this, but how do we start to break down the, like, I'm not polite if I
yep,
don't say ma'am or sir, versus like, am I actually being more polite because I'm being aware,
right,
societally aware? So, how do we like separate some of those things for the people who really have been raised,
right.
like, I don't want to be not polite?
I think it's about being very intentional, um, and also thinking about the other things for which we're willing to do that and that we don't feel the resistance. So I'd often tell people when somebody gets a doctorate, do you feel resistance to call them doctor whoever now that they have a doctorate or an MD? This is an addition to the way that you used to refer to them. It's a shift. You have to be deliberate and mindful about remembering that they now have that term attached to their name. If somebody gets married, the shift between Miss and Mrs. that happens in a lot of parts of the country, or now we have the gender neutral mix that can be used, which is what my students called me, Mix Turnwald, MX. So yeah, I think being very deliberate, asking ourselves if we're meeting resistance on making this shift, where that resistance comes from, knowing that it's okay to examine that. And again, it doesn't mean, I always say the most dangerous binary that we're taught is the good bad binary. That if we make mistakes in these things, that we're automatically bad, and that's just not the case.
Right.
There's a big difference between hearing and learning and receiving that information and making deliberate shifts, and people who intentionally say and do things to cause harm. Now, of course, when we're told that we're causing harm and we continue to resist that shift, then there's a whole nother conversation to be had there. Um, but the reality is, we're all going to make mistakes. You know, my partner has even misgendered me at times. It's one of the ways that I know that her brain is really, really tired, and she says to me, it's really funny to her too, because when it happens, it's even shocking to her. And she's like, because I don't think of you in terms of n- a binary gender. um, but it's happened before.
Mhm.
And it's the being deliberate about making the correction, being deliberate about making habits that are going to shift that, examining, okay, what are the alternatives that I can use, having sort of your stockpile of information when you're trying to replace a word. Um, and I go back to as well being invested in learning history.
Mhm.
So when we talk about, gender inclusive language, the they them as a singular has existed since like the 1400s. It's been used in that way. And so when people are like, well, this is such a new thing, I'm like, actually not. Um, and you'll see people argue against the use of the they them pronoun. And in the process of explaining why they're against it, will use a singular they. And you're like, hmm. Um, yeah.
It is interesting, right? Because hmm, I'm a believer in that we can always find proof for something, right? So we can find, I call it, I call it the Dodge Caravan phenomenon, actually, is because when you're not looking for Dodge Caravans, you don't see any, but then as soon as you're looking for Dodge Caravans, you can see a whole bunch of them. But there's always, and especially with the internet nowadays, right? Like you can find proof of anything, right? My husband's favorite is the Flat Earth Society, but that's for a different show. But and this is the thing, right? Like I think, I don't know. I do think a lot of it comes back to this, like you said, right and wrong, good and bad, right? And if we think about anything binary, really, bipartisan politics, like binary genders, binary right, wrong, good, bad, right? Like,
Mhm.
I just feel like in the human experience is mostly gray.
Yes, and when we think about the gender binary, we can also ask the question, who or what is invested in maintaining that binary?
Right.
And when we talk about, the United States, I have a friend who always uses the quote about, if you live in the United States, you live in a three-cornered house. And that house includes white supremacy, the patriarchy, um, and oh, where did my third one go? um,
And there's one more important one, folks.
yes, uh, but in talking specifically about the patriarchy, so if people gain power through the patriarchy and they are able to maintain a binary where masculine and male and patriarchy is the power structure, and then the other side of that binary doesn't have power or is able to have their power mitigated in some way. um, if that becomes a spectrum, that breaks down the patriarchy in some fashion, and that takes some of that power away. So who's invested in maintaining that?
Patriarchy.
Yeah.
You know what's really interesting is I was having a conversation with my dad earlier today, and I don't
Oh,
know why
I
we're
remembered
talking.
what the third one is. It's
Oh,
capitalism. It's white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, the three-cornered house.
huh.
Oh.
Oh, that all of those things need their own episode. But it was really interesting because one of the things I personally, I don't feel like I've experienced gender, like, because I identify as she, her. My dad identifies as he, him, and it was just so weird because I all I said was I don't feel like I've ever experienced this, and he was like, I have, and I was like, I'm sorry, what?
Right.
We're like a 60-year-old white man. I'm confused,
Interesting.
but it's really interesting, and I want to. It's related to Megan's question about how about whether or not you have thoughts about helping people move towards intentional language with regard to cultural lines. I would say pretty much anything that we would consider traditional. Working with teams that are from a more traditional culture, like what if you have a what if you have people on your team who are all about capitalism and the patriarchy and white supremacy, right? Like, how do we begin to address that as people who notice it? And usually
Well,
it's not so easy just to like call the kettle black.
one, the first thing I would be addressing is if people are into all of those things, how is it affecting all the other ways in which they navigate in that business? Because that would already be a chief concern for me. Um, but two, I think we have to talk to people in terms of what is our care and investment in other people. So are you so invested in this term that you're willing to hurt someone in order to use it? And having that conversation is going to reveal a lot of things.
Mm.
And then if you are so invested in it that you're willing to hurt someone to use it, are you providing a psychologically safe place for someone else to be working with you in that space? And then that's an HR issue. So, I mean, there's a very human level conversation that we can have. Um, and if the human level conversation doesn't yield a willingness to take these things into consideration, then we also have to look at the business level consideration of, are these appropriate working behaviors?
Mhm. Well, and Jackie, maybe we can take that one step further because you do DEI work as well, and
Sure.
I know for the last 40 years, business has been all about process, right? So when everybody started implementing DEI initiatives, and then we'll call them that, but are they really? Probably not.
Whole other lives too.
Yeah. Oh, so many lives to do. There's a lot of things that became like a checking of the box, right?
Mhm.
Like I have this percentage of people who identify as this, and I have this percentage of people. And if we do that, and none of those people still feel safe at
Right.
work, then we don't really have a DEI initiative,
Correct.
right? So how
You have a
businesses
diversity
still
initiative, but
right,
not
and
an
not
equity
inclusion,
and
not
a
equity.
belonging initiative. Yeah.
Right. And so at the end of the day, business is about they're there to make money, right? And even if it's just to make money to pay their employees, right? Like we're here to make a certain amount of money to do a thing. And so, what are some of the things that we can just start to knowing that businesses are still in business to make money? How do we start to incorporate some of these things on an actual DEIB perspective to I mean, I think there's lots of things that don't exist in business without these types of
Right.
conversations and psychological safety, but there's still a lot of places who can't seem to crack the nut on how we can actually create an environment of equity and
Right.
inclusivity.
Well, and oftentimes I think that having the mindset to crack that nut often is harder to gain from people who have not had experiences where they have felt on the other side of that. Um, and again, that is the challenge of, all right, so being someone in a historically excluded group, um, how much responsibility do I have to educate people who haven't had those experiences? Because there's a certain amount of understanding that they're not going to have unless some of those experiences are shared or learned about. Um, but also, how much responsibility do I have to my own psychological safety? And there are times where it's not going to be safe or comfortable for me to do that. Um, I don't know. There's so much there in that. Like, if we want to talk about the unpacking of business as a means of making money and where DEI fits in that, I mean, that's a whole nother thing too. But we start with the basic fact of, if people don't feel safe, do you think that they're working very well? Like, if you constantly have stressors, if you are constantly being misgendered, or you are constantly receiving racist commentary from people around you, um, how deeply invested and engaged are you going to feel in that space?
Mhm.
And my question is always not, what do your diversity numbers look like? My question is always, what are your retention of diverse employee numbers look like? Are people staying once they're there? Are they excelling? Are they growing? Like, these are the conversations that we have to get people into, because it's not just about somebody getting in the door. It's also it's about all the things that happen once they're there.
Okay, so let's bring this back to inclusive language, right? Because I think inclusive language is a player in this arena. And so, actually, I want to just, even before, we have to start from this like paying attention level, right?
Right.
Like where we even notice that what we said have an impact. And it's it's the most helpful when someone will just come back to you and be like, hey, that was not inclusive, can you please review your language? And I mean, if someone said that to me, I would be totally open to that and like receiving feedback that way. But you have to be aware of like how people receive feedback, right? You have to be aware of just kind of the feeling in the room, right? Because Megan was asking about teams, right? And I always say this, one person standing at the front of the room, 10 people in the room, right? And one person says a thing. There are 10 possible ways to interpret that information. Yeah. And one of the downsides in most business environments that I have experienced is that we don't even consider the fact that there's 10 different perspectives, right? And so it's not that the information is necessarily different, but every single person has different filters. They have their own experience that they're receiving information through. And if we pay attention, we can tell some of those things, right? Like I've been in, not a lot of scenarios, but I've definitely been in scenarios where I say something and you can tell it's made someone uncomfortable. And it may not be because of gender identity or culture. It might just be because of like someone's having a bad day, right? There could be a multitude of reasons why this is true, but if you pay attention, you can tell.
Absolutely.
Right. And so in terms of like paying attention to our language, just what are some of the like key flag words you would say? Like I noticed like ladies and gentlemen, right? Like, okay, nope.
Yeah.
It's not inclusive. What are some of the like flag words that we could notice ourselves saying? And what are some words that we can use instead?
Right. So of course, with the ladies and gentlemen, using a more gender neutral greeting, colleagues, folks, friends, people. There's so many options actually. And so, yeah, using a more gender neutral greeting. One that was always something to think about in the classroom is a lot of teachers will have something that they're sending home to get signed, and they'll say, take this to your mom or dad, or take this to your parents. And when we look at the composition of our classrooms, not everybody lives with a mom and a dad. Some people live with a mom and a mom. Some people live with a dad and a dad. Some people live with their grandmother or their aunt. And so using a term like take this home to the adult in your life, the trusted adult in your life, or to a guardian, shifting that language to make sure that every kid in the room is actually hearing something that is receptive to what their situation is. And a lot of people don't actually think about that. We talk about your husband or wife. And
this is one I am trying to work.
Right. We make that into a binary, and you can say spouse or partner instead. So all of these terms tend to have a really good substitution for them. We have a tendency in our language to also to default to masculine as a gender neutral, mankind instead of humankind.
Even like, so my son, he's a big fan of garage doors, and he calls the door like from the house into the garage the man door. And I was like, how about the people door?
Right.
Because I go through it too, right?
Yeah.
Oh, people door.
Yeah. And there are so many words that when we start to think about them and the connotations that can be attached to them, it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense why we should change that. And one of the words that comes up in this conversation for me all the time is the word master. So we talk about that word in terms of the master bedroom in a house. But this term evokes plantation era periods of time, whether that's the origin of it or not. And so shifting that language to say the main bedroom, or I know a while back.
Actually, I just moved, and it was funny because I was telling the movers to like I have master bedroom things, and the movers who were all men were like, actually, we don't call it that anymore. We call it the primary bedroom.
Right.
And I was like, oh,
right. And someone made a similar case for the golf tournament, the Masters golf tournament, that they should change the name of it. And if you look back on the history of that tournament, it was originally played at Augusta National, if I remember correctly. And Augusta National actually banned Black golfers from playing up until 1975 and required all of their caddies to be Black. And so like the history with that, as well as coupling that title with that term, makes a reasonable case for why we would shift that language. Yeah, I don't even think they let women on the course until I think it was 2012. Yeah. And so
what we learned today, you guys, is that really none of us know our own history, and we really should learn more about it.
And I think that is a big part of all DEI initiatives, is the more we can understand history clearly, the more we can understand the shifts and changes we need to make and why we need to make them.
I think that, oh my gosh, I feel like we opened a huge can of worms with this. And I do want to just, this is one of my favorite things to do with this show. It's actually the point of the show, because I don't believe anything. I've seen a lot of people get really passionate in a conversation, right? And then they go, we saw this happen with when Roe and Wade was overturned, right? Everybody got into, and Jackie, when I met you the first time, it was that day. And there was like so much passion for a day, right? And then or maybe a week, and then people just stopped talking about it. Well, if we stop talking about it, then we're not going to accomplish anything. And we're not, having a conversation is about like picking a direction you want to go and exploring that direction, because it's not about, and we gave you some new inclusive language that you guys can try and learn today. If you're unfamiliar with me, my favorite is PEEP. I love to use PEEP. My community is called Your Business Peeps, just because PEEP is a fun word. And team. I grew up playing basketball, but even this, right? Like, can you not talk about this? Because I just went to my high school basketball coach's celebration of life, which was a beautiful event. But even there, right? You're like, you have representatives from the men's football team. We were the Lady Bulldogs, right? Because we're the girls team. We have like Academy Awards for Best Actress and Best Actor. And I've always been confused why they can't go in the same category. We're all doing the same skill, right? Like we're acting.
Best performer.
Yes. And see, I think this is the fun thing, right? Like, there wasn't a thing that popped into my head, but there was a thing that popped into Jackie's head. These are the cool things that we can explore in conversation. Also, when we're not feeling so attached to the fact, like, well, like I didn't decide that it should be Best Actress and Best Actor, right? Like, I don't understand that, and I can explore whether or not I think that makes sense. And hopefully, I mean, the academy is pretty traditional, so
Yes.
they'll probably take a minute to change any of those things. And oh man, I feel like we could do an episode just on the Academy Awards and
A
how not
minute is a
inclusive they
very
are.
long time in academy terms.
Yeah. um, and so this is just how we can learn, right? And I think if we can just take peel learning back to how we felt about it when we were a kid, right? Like
Right.
I have a 4-year-old. He doesn't. He falls off his bike, right? He falls off the playground equipment, and then he just gets back up and he does it again. He tries it differently to find a way that works, right? And this is what learning is supposed to look like.
Right.
And we have to go through the same exercise with our language. And so we probably will. I'm sure. I'm gonna just go ahead and say I definitely will screw it
Yeah.
up at some point in the future because I'm programmed a certain way that isn't to be inclusive all the time. And if we hold ourselves to this, if we associate a lot of wrongness, badness, fear with getting it wrong, we can't get it right because we'll be so afraid to try. We won't try. And all we can do is stay in this mode of, well, I'm comfortable with
And
this.
then in our own comfort, we continue to socialize other people into the same behaviors.
Mhm. And this is like, I know I'm going to do it to some degree to my son because I can't help but do it. Like, I'm
Oh,
not doing it on purpose.
we're all subject to these things, which is why we
Right.
have to be intentional about unpacking them. Yeah,
Mhm.
they're all around us.
And what if again, this is kind of the point of this series is what if it felt good? What if it felt fun to unpack these things where all of a sudden you're like, oh, hey, like I said at the beginning of the session when I read that post about why wouldn't we just all like with our language treat people as gender neutral until we know otherwise? And I was like, that's genius.
Right,
I'm sure
right.
whoever, actually, I'm pretty sure it was Atlas. So shout out to Atlas. Like they have probably been thinking that for years and that it's so simple.
Mhm.
And then finally they put it on social media and gave people like me access to the idea. And you're like, oh, this is genius. Which goes to like another piece that I feel I want to just touch on this too before we're finished today, Jackie, in terms of the sharing and the responsibility, because we talked about that a
Right.
little bit, right? And one of my beliefs is that you should share when you feel called to share,
Yes.
right? So if you want to tell somebody your pronouns, you should. If you don't want to, you shouldn't. If you want to reveal it in a meeting at work, if you don't want to reveal it in a meeting at work, and it's just like they take it from there. And if you want to say something, say it. And if you don't, explore, right? Like start exploring like why is this? Am I afraid of judgment? Am I afraid like in a workplace that
Right.
I'll get fired? Like what are we afraid of? Because it's also really important to look at our own biases about sharing who we are. Um,
Absolutely.
with and it, I always say this, right? Of like if I am a basketball player, right? We'll simplify it in a very generic term. If I'm a basketball player, I can decide to tell people I'm a basketball player, or I can decide not to tell people I'm a basketball player. Sometimes I use an example that will show I'm a basketball player, but I don't have fear
Right.
associated with telling people I'm a basketball player. And that's because historically, societally, there has been no
It's not a
judgment.
safety issue with being a basketball
Right.
player.
Right. And so when we're talking about the bigger picture of
Right,
inclusivity, this comes into play a lot. And there has been and still are a lot of places where it's not safe.
right.
Um, and I just actually let's end with this because I'm a huge believer in community, Jackie. Like how can we go about finding the places? Because I don't believe we're ever all gonna feel completely psychologically safe in all spaces. That's just not gonna happen. But how can we find the spaces? What are some things that would say to us, okay, this is a place where people are open, are trying, are exploring.
That's the challenge, really. because sometimes the least safe places are places where it seems like people are doing that, and then when they get corrected, they double down in ways that are really harmful.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's actually just really important to remember that when people are taking that risk, trying to use inclusive language, sharing about their own personal identity in ways that are vulnerable, that we either when it's us or when it's someone who we would like to be an ally to, that we remember that they're taking a personal risk when we do that,
Mm.
and we honor that. I think that would help to make some spaces safer, if people think in that framework. Um, but there's just no guarantee, honestly. You can look for lots of markers, people using the language themselves or inviting things or, showing that they participate in certain groups or whatnot, but it, there's always the possibility of that risk, and you really just don't know until you know.
Mhm. And I saw this movie like years ago, which is a totally, completely ridiculous movie. But one of the phrases they kept using it was, you have to risk it to get the biscuit."
Oh dear.
And I don't know why I always think that, but there is inherent risk in a lot of these things, right? And it, I don't. It would be nice to believe that it's possible to remove all of the risk before we went and shared some of these things, right? Maybe in some future beautiful dystopian world where all of this exists and like we are all just even on the food chain with the animals and everything as well, that maybe that's true. But I know I would just encourage you guys to not give up on people.
Right.
I did it. I did it. Did you see? I said, guys, you guys. That's
Yeah.
not
Y'all.
inclusive, right? Y'all. I
That's a
kind of
good
love
inclusive
y'all.
southernism.
Actually.
Y'all. All y'all.
Even though I'm Canadian and the y'all doesn't come naturally, but all
Right.
y'all is just it's a good thing. When we show up, sometimes we're going to get it wrong, right? We're going to trust the wrong person. We're going to share this in the wrong space. We're going to do these things. And so the last thing I just want to leave everyone with is that just forgive yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Default to
You got it
educational
wrong.
humility.
Yeah.
Educational humility. We
You
have
learned
to
something.
default to that in order to grow. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I feel like we could talk forever on this topic, but we're going to wrap it up for today. Megan was just she said, just thank you. She's so happy that she stumbled across this. This is why we go live, because you never know who's going to stumble across the conversation. So Jackie, for people like Megan and other people who want to remain in this conversation, to explore their inclusive language more for themselves, what are some great resources for them, and or where is the best place to find you?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. I post content almost daily. And you can also check out Human Centric, which is the consulting that I do, DEI consulting through Human Centric LLC. My partner does leadership coaching. And yeah, you can find us both on LinkedIn pretty frequently. And as far as resources go, I always tell people to start with the Googles and go from there, because we have so much information at our fingertips. And then, looking at who all is recommending different resources gives us a good sort of way to narrow it down.
Yeah, absolutely. Explore, you guys.
Oh,
Explore. Peeps. Explore, peeps. I'm getting rid
commitment
of
to
this, you guys.
self-education.
I haven't noticed how often I say that. Now I gotta start paying attention. See,
Yeah,
this is how we learn, you guys.
got a word. Now give yourself an
Look
accountability
at look
partner.
how look it like, and this is the thing, right? That's just something that I
Yep,
use commonly in my language that I've
yep.
never paid attention to before, and now it's gonna take a minute. I'm gonna go back and rewatch this and see how many times I say it, because now I've caught myself saying it at least 3 times. But peeps, peeps, explore for yourself and learn, right? I could take this away and be like, oh my God, I'm the worst. I was on an inclusive language show and they said, you guys, like, who knows how many times. This is the point. I'm not perfect. I'm never going to be perfect. Nor are you. And so this is the fun, right? We can turn these types of things into fun and be like, wow, never realized how often I say that. Now I can start to learn to try something else and get something new that I say on an ongoing basis. Because really, I should say peeps anyway. Peeps is my word. I should say peeps. This has been so great. I learned so much today. Thank you so much for the beautiful conversation today, Jackie. Thank you guys so much for being it. I did it again. Thank you, everyone, for being in the comments. Oh, man. I'm going to really pay attention to this. I'm going to just
now that you've heard it, you keep hearing it. Yes.
It's like in Toastmasters. I used to be in Toastmasters, and when you're the grammarian, you start listening for ums and ahs and things like that, and then that's all you can hear, and you're like, jeez, everybody's umming and ahhing themselves.
The great part is, though, I feel like it's with so many things. So once you hear it or once you know about it, you can't unknow it, you can't unhear it, and you're going to start catching it.
Yeah. That's the fun. So you're welcome for me being a very good example of how we can learn. And that doesn't mean that we're going to be perfect, because we all have habits and we will break them and we will build new ones. And it takes a minute. So give yourself the space to go through that journey, because at the end of the day, it is definitely worth it. And I think for those of you who have seen the show before as well, I believe in staying in the conversation. So connect with Jackie, connect with their partner, connect with me. There's lots of people in this conversation. So learn, explore, right? And just listen. Heck, listen to your self-talk.
And literally listening is one of the best ways to grow. We like to talk and hear ourselves, but I've spent years listening to people of different lived experiences that have changed the way I've seen the world and how I walk in it.
And this is really the only way to do that, peeps, is that we only know our own journey. It's the journey we walked, right? We know that. And unless one of my favorite things to say is your experience is valid. Everybody has a different experience than mine. And just because it's different than mine doesn't mean it's not valid. That's their experience. And when I can listen and I can learn from those experiences, and I feel like, I keep thinking about this quote and I'm going to bungle it up, but it's that quote about how, like, when you don't know, you can't do something, but once you know better, do better. Right. And better is actually one of my least favorite words, because I think it doesn't really mean anything. Better and what? How much better in what direction? But when we can do that, we only have the opportunity to do better by listening to other people and hearing about their experiences. So I hope that everyone has a little bit more space for themselves after this conversation to explore your own language, to explore how language is impacting you, and how maybe we can just do a little bit more for each other by listening. Oh, Jackie, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation today. People, make sure you can connect with Jackie. Like her social media content, LinkedIn content is so good. You want it. It's awesome. It keeps me in that arena of asking myself the questions, right? How am I incorporating this? Am I not? Because we get busy. We get busy as people. Yeah. It's very easy to default back to the way we've always done it. Right. So let's all work together to not be the peeps who just do it the way we've always done it, but continue to grow and learn and thrive throughout our entire lives. With that, everybody, thank you so much for joining today. And until next time, permission to do you.